I'll get the panel introduced and we can start, I think, by having a little discussion here on the panel and then open it up for Q&A, so I'm sure everyone's got a lot of questions. I just want to say a little bit about OneVoice first of all, for those who don't know who we are. We're a grassroots organisation that works in parallel in Israel and Palestine. And what we try and do is train up young people in both the occupied territories and in Israel to try and assume positions of leadership. So in those terms, it's a very interesting film to watch, to see an Israeli leader who's been at such a position since basically the foundation of state before, and see what you can learn positive and negative from that. What I will also say quickly before we start is this is the first in a series of films, and there's a second film on Yasser Arafat, which we're also going to be screening next month on the 28th of February, 27th of February. So if you filled out the clipboard that's going around, put in your email address, or else like us on Facebook, and we'll be able to let you know about the screening details as soon as they're finalised. So I'm just going to quickly introduce the panel. So on my immediate left over here is Paul Charney. Paul is the chairman of the Zionist Federation here in the UK. He grew up in South Africa before emigrating to Israel in 1986, and has served as a lieutenant in the IDF between 1992 and 1996. And actually, just told us there, was in Rabin Square on the evening of the assassination of the Prime Minister. He qualified as a solicitor in 2002 and has worked for various city law firms here in London before setting up his own strategic land and planning company. He's a member of Conservative Friends of Israel, the Association of the Well-Being of Israel Soldiers, and other charitable organisations. On my right here is Dr. Ghada Karmi. Ghada is a Palestinian doctor of medicine, an author and an academic. She writes frequently in Palestinian issues in newspapers and magazines, including The Guardian, The Nation, and the Journal of Palestine Studies. She's a fellow and lecturer at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at Exeter University. And then finally is Richard Symons, who is the co-director of the film that you just saw, and actually we have the other co-director, Joanna, here in the audience too. He is the founder and director at Spirit Level Film, and before directing The Price of Kings, he co-directed and produced a film called The Fear Factory, which was an expose of the UK's criminal justice system. It was screened in the Home Office, the Welsh Assembly, and Scotland Yard, and then it went on to inspire a coalition of over 60 organisations here in the UK to lobby for more effective policies in that area. So now that we've kind of got everybody introduced, I'll take the liberty of kind of asking the first question. I think it should really be Richard. It's incredible to see the breadth of history that Shimon Peres has been directly responsible for within the context of. And I don't know, I've seen that film 3 or 4 times now, and every time I see it, I'm a little bit more ambiguous in the way that I feel about it.
Well, which way does that mean? You're going...
It depends on what's going on in the news. It's difficult. I mean, I've met him once before myself. I think he's a very complicated man. But you've had the privilege of sitting with him mostly for a prolonged period to interview him. Yeah. And I think, particularly within the context of Israeli elections that have produced leaders who, whether you agree with them or don't agree with them, are certainly not as large in stature as Shimon Peres. I wonder what kind of insights you got from his own leadership and his capacity to lead.
What insights? I think he's in a tough job. He came across me as deeply conflicted. He's sort of built a nation, and there are various bits and pieces that he doesn't agree with. I think ultimately he doesn't have the backbone to stand up. I'd like to see him sort of threaten resignation over what's been going on in the last sort of decade or so. But it's kind of, I suspect it's his call. You know, he's the only guy who can, he's standing at the top of that mountain. He's got the most experience and vision. And he's the only guy who can say, well, I think I'm better off compromising, staying in my job, doing what I can behind the scenes, and taking the flak for being seen as being a Christian and not. But he appeared as a deeply conflicted man.
So it's almost that lack of leadership, in your view, that's allowed him to be able to be at the pinnacle of leadership for as long as he has.
Well, he's always been a brilliant second in command. Ben Gurion would say to him, I think we need to build a city here, but we need arms from here. And he'd go and do it. So he's a brilliant prosecutor of visions. I don't know if he's such a great deliverer of the vision he arrived at in the early 90s of peace. Well, clearly he hasn't been. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, Ghada, obviously, the story of Shimon Peres for a great number of people is tied up completely with the foundation of the building of the State of Israel. Of course, from the perspective of Palestinians, a completely different person that you judge him as a leader, and very different sequence of facts and history that you would choose to focus on, I assume, rather than Israelis or Zionists would. I mean, I wonder if you talk a little bit about what the figure of Shimon Peres looks like to Palestinian society, whether it's evolved in the same way as it certainly has in Israel over time, over the different roles it's played.
Well, you know, the first thing that struck me watching this film is how uninteresting this man is. I mean, really, remember that when we had the sequence about the killing of Rabin, that was much more magnetic, because it was about Rabin and what was happening to him, than this man who we've been following his life story for ages. So that's the first sort of general comment I make. And I totally agree about that. You put it quite well. He's a second in command. This chap is a number 2. He's not, you know, if you were to say, what was his great achievement, you'd have to scratch your head, because there isn't anything that comes to the fore. He's a faithful servant of Zionism, that's quite clear. And he did what he was told, and he went along with things, and but really, he's pretty colourless himself. Now, that's in terms of looking at the film as just a person, you know, watching it. But as a Palestinian, of course, you know, how can I put this? I mean, Shimon Peres, it represents a kind of Zionist, which is really lethal for the Palestinians. I tell you what I mean. He comes across as emollient, as apparently having learned much in life, as wise, as liberal, etc. But of course he's not, because if you look at what he did, what he was engaged in for most of his active life, it was to build Zionism, to build Israel, at the expense of whom? The people who actually used to live in that land, you know. So it's not going to impress a Palestinian to see this man with his dedication to Zionism trying to make out, if you like, that he's actually very nice, and that he is interested in peace, and he admires Arafat for, what is he admiring Arafat for? For defeat? For the fact that the Palestinians started off with the whole land as being their homeland, and now end up with virtually nothing, but then at the time of Arafat, you know, that they would have accepted 22% of the land. Wonderful, you know, what a defeat that is. So, honestly, I must tell you, there are many Palestinians who would say to you, give me Ariel Sharon any time. And now these Netanyahu and these dreadful right-wingers in Europe are coming into the new Israeli government. Give me them any time, thank you, because we know where we stand with them, rather than Peres and his ilk, who is slippery and appears to be wanting to be nice and all things to all men.
I mean, from the film and from your own sort of expertise in the area, do you think he's sincere when he does talk about the willingness to give the 22% of historical Palestine and to see a two-state solution come about from the Oslo period onwards?
Well, you know, it's very difficult to know. It's very difficult, you know why? Because he's done absolutely nothing to stop the settlement, the continuous colonization of the West Bank. I mean, somebody who's really interested in saying to the Palestinians, as by the way, Rabin is a different sort of personality. He's quite interesting in that way. But I mean, this man says, you know, we really must make peace, and we must do this, and we must do that. But he's done absolutely nothing to stop the settlement project. And as far as Jerusalem is concerned, I have quotations of him saying, they will never give up Jerusalem. They will never share. Jerusalem is Jewish. You know, so you really have to ask, what does it mean if a man like this says, we must give the Arabs their rights, we must do this, we must do that, when at the same time you do nothing to oppose government policy. It's not very impressive.
I mean, Paul, it's interesting because you'll get a lot of criticism for Shimon Peres from every direction in Israeli society. And there's people I know in Israel on the right who, and we saw some of them in Richard's film, who would be just as vocal critics of Peres as Palestinians, or those on the left might be. I mean, from your time living in Israel and knowing sort of how Israeli politics go, do you think that the criticisms from the right and left sort of make him a central figure or a figure without substance, as I think both Richard and Ghada have indicated?
Well, it's interesting because Shimon Peres has changed over the course of Israeli history. The Israeli society has changed over the course of Israeli history. The leadership has also changed. So I think as he's changed together with society, so many people's opinion in him have changed back and forward as well. We talk about, Dr. Karmi talked about uninteresting and things about Shimon Peres, but I mean, I can tell you that Israel, who certainly for the last, since its inception, is one of the leaders of agriculture in the world, and has taken technology, agriculture technology across Africa to help feed people with minimum amount of water, was set up and established by Shimon Peres, who understood that leads to the entire desert and swampland that was there from the early 20th century needed to be developed in order to create. Those are the kibbutzim. That's what needed to be developed in order to feed and become a world leader in agriculture. He then moved that on to technology. Israel is now one of the leaders in technology because of Shimon Peres' dream and actions. And he set up, so as an example, there's a guy named Shai Agassi who set up, I think you'll know him, he sets up Better Place, which deals with electric cars across Israel. It's now the leading country in electric cars and environmental green across the country. And that was him dealing with all of that.
Well, that's interesting microcosm, because if you stack up Shimon Peres' achievements on paper, I mean, it's incredible, almost as a function of the fact that he was there at the front seat for such a large duration of the birth estate of Israel. But it seems like they're not the sum of their parts. He is somehow less than that. The film, I think, indicated in a lot of what we've heard so far. Do you think that's probably the consensus view within Israeli politics too? Israeli friends have told me that he's perceived now as a loser, despite the fact he's been there the whole time.
The only reason they would say that is because he lost every election that he had in Israel.
That's a substantial reason.
He was never elected as a prime minister. He always came second to somebody else who became prime minister. But as an achiever in Israeli society, he's not seen that way. As a politician, as a prime minister, he's seen as a potential loser. But in everything else in Zionism, I mean, he formulated the defense system of Israel, which was defined by kibbutzim within Israel, and then defending the borders around Israel. And the dual building up, Zionism was building up Israel despite the Arab nations doing everything they possibly can to not let this happen. So together, the defense together with building a society simultaneously was difficult. It was a very difficult thing to do, because you've got your society and societal issues, which currently Israel have today, like every other society. It has its good, it has its bad, it has its right, it has its left. We saw by the elections the absolute split down society of where the elections went, both left and right down the middle. Building that flourishing society, which you saw in Europe, together with a very strong defense of Arab nations.
It could also be argued, I think, and I think this is for the whole panel really, the film illustrated that while Israel on the one hand can be very proud of many of its achievements in business and finance and technology, there is a sickness at the centre of the country as well, which I would argue personally is a function of the occupation. Shimon Peres has been in a position to be able to end that, either as within the executive or now in a position where Israelis listen to him. I asked Ghada whether she thought that he was sincere in his pursuit of a two-state solution. I think I want to ask both of you really whether you think not only is he sincere, much like I think it was Ruth Diane said, that talking about it is one thing, but you actually have to do it. And he's been in a position where he's been able to. Do you think he's not only sincere in saying it, or that he can actually surprise us at nearly 90 and make something happen?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. At the time, I mean, I have no doubt he was sincere in dealing with the Palestinian issue in the land where they live at the moment. And the big problem was at the time was essentially from 47 to 67, the Palestinians were under Jordanian occupation, essentially part of Jordan, which is essentially a Palestinian state. And through the wars, when Israel took the part of the West Bank and Jerusalem, and that the additional parts of Jerusalem, it became under Israeli occupation. So initially, he tried to force King Hussein and the Jordanians to take back what is essentially a problem which Israel didn't want. And when that became impossible, and they said, no, it's not going to happen. It's not our issue anymore. You conquered it, it's yours now. I think then Shimon Peres...
Let me just correct you there, because that wasn't the Jordanians who said no. That was Shimon who said no.
Right.
In the London Agreement, that was a done and dusted deal, and Yitzhak Shamir said no way.
Shamir said no way for very small part, for parts of it. I'm not going to go into specific, for parts of the West Bank. So, for example, the Kotel, the Western Wall. Some parts
Let's not go into too much detail.
But fine, okay. Yeah. But in essence, what he did want to do was solve the problem, either through a Jordanian solution, let's say, but then through through a solution even dealing with Arafat, who was at the time very, very seen as a real enemy of the state.
But it's interesting, I mean, that agreement was fashioned here in London, and he did have the colonies to come back to Israel and change into the fact that he refused to sign on to it. I mean, I think that is maybe symbolic of that vacuum of leadership at the very, very pinnacle that has been identified.
It's just one small, it's not a vacuum of leadership. You've got to remember, it's a very new society, and it's a highly volatile, changing society.
Absolutely.
So it went from left to right to left to right to left to right. So you have a very small time frame. Any peacemaker in Israel has a very small time frame within which to implement a peace deal. And I think if I had to defend him,
yeah.
And what you say, some of it, I'm not going to be able to defend fully, but if I can defend some of it, is that you run out of time in Israel to implement any policy.
Absolutely. And I will say as well that it seems as if it's Shimon Peres getting a very tough time, Yasser Arafat's going to get a tough time in 4 weeks as well. I'm going to open it up now to the floor for questions. So,
can I just say something before? Yeah. Look, first of all, Shimon Peres is, you say he's known for defending agriculture. Actually, he's known for establishing the nuclear reactor in Dimona and for making Israel, helping Israel to become a nuclear armed state, which is extremely dangerous for the region. So that is not an achievement of any kind. The other thing is that although you point out, I think you're pointing out about that there were these that he developed various sides of Israeli life, etc. You know, you can imagine that this doesn't impress Palestinians or people actually not who don't like colonialism, because it's like saying that you've taken somebody, you've stolen somebody's house, and you've painted it so beautifully and decorated it, and it's wonderfully furnished, and you should be admired for doing all this. But actually, it was never your house. So it's a classic, it's a classic situation in which the basic premise is one we don't agree with, which is that this land does not belong to these people who came into it. They took it in a variety of ways, which I'm sure people here who know history know how it happened. And the fact they did this or that with it is not impressive. It was a colonial enterprise.
That's a fundamental disagreement at the essence of everything we're going to talk about. But I think it's possible, and it'd be interesting when we open this out to the floor, to be able to take that. You can agree to disagree, and people on this panel certainly do, and then look at Peres' positive and negative achievements. And quite often, those very achievements might be positive in Israel and negative in the Palestinian territories. And the nuclear example, I think, is a very good example.
Yeah.
But I think it's still possible to be able to look at them objectively, acceptingly.
Yes, and the other thing that I wanted to pick up on was this left-right business. This is more apparent than real. You know, politics in Israel, whether it's left or right, one thing, it's never ever, it had no variations of policy in terms of colonizing the rest of Palestine. Whether the government was a right-wing one or a left-wing government, after all, after 67 it was a Labour government. and that the majority of these settlements were built by Labour administrations, supposedly on the left. So one must be quite clear that that is not as it would seem. And the final thing, which is about the West Bank, sorry, I won't go on and on, but the West Bank and Jordan and so on, of course this is very pernicious, because the idea that successive Israeli leaders have had is that Jordan is the Palestinian state, and to solve the problem, you know, those unwanted Palestinians can go there, and then everybody, apart from the Palestinians, will be happy. So I just wanted to make that clear.
With that caveat, the first hand up was here in front, in purple.
My question is this: there seems to be sort of block label like Paris and Israel saying, look, they're not interested in peace. But like in anything, and I'm sure there's also OneVoice, there's two partners in this. And maybe one of the reasons that Paris was not able to have a peace agreement was, for instance, during 1995, the suicide bombings. For instance, maybe it's, I mean, there's another side, and it's like you're completely ignoring, for instance, that in 2000, when Israel offered peace, they were rejected by the so-called moderate leader Arafat. So perhaps you need to stop blaming Israel so much and look at their own Palestinian leaders who are killing the hopes of their own Palestinians. Because every time they've been given a peace opportunity, they've said no. I mean, even like Abbas, he said, I'm not willing to negotiate. I'll go to you, I'm not willing to negotiate with Israel. You may blame Israel, I'm not saying Netanyahu is perfect, but what about the other side?
Okay, Ghada's obviously going to answer this question, but I actually also want to ask Rich, because he has sat with so many Palestinian political figures who were, you know, in very serious positions during this period. But what do you think? I mean, is that a valid criticism? Is it a valid balance that needs to be injected?
What, that the Palestinians aren't partners in peace?
The leaders, not the people, the leaders.
The leaders are. I don't think it is a valid criticism, no. I think Arafat definitely, well, I was certainly convinced during the making of the Arafat film that he was completely committed to a peaceful solution, completely committed. And for him, I think you see in the Arafat film how difficult it was for him to ride along with the Intifada. That was a tough choice for him. But he felt that was his only option. I think Abbas is committed to peace. I don't think he's got an option. And Netanyahu has been a bit of a prick about it, frankly, and hasn't given him any openings. I can't see where Abbas has been unreasonable by saying, stop building settlements and we'll sit down and chat about this.
They did a pre-settlement building in 2010.
Yeah, so explain to me this. If they could freeze it in 2010, why couldn't they continue freezing it when Abbas said, well, stop, if you hold off, stop building the settlements?
So let's go back to Arafat quickly, just once on that. You said he's a partner in peace, but he was offered 98% of what he wanted. Prince Band of Saudi Arabia said he should accept it.
Sorry?
Really a partner in peace? He started a second.
What I'd like to do, if possible, is avoid the kind of zero-sum calculus where everything has to be one party's fault and everything has to be the other party's fault, because we're just going to end up in a game of tennis in that sense. I'm going to pick another question, actually. Yes, gentleman in the back.
Well, it's clear to me that Zionism is incompatible with peace because its foundation is a religious or a political philosophy that believes in Eretz Israel or Greater Israel, which believes that obtaining land either by force or by political means to expand and then to settle a Jewish population. And there's so many myths that come. The gentleman said they were over 90% of that. That's not true.
Sorry, could you speak up a little? Yeah.
I'm just saying that it's clear to me that there can't be any peace as long as Zionism is the preeminent political ideology of Israel, because this whole concept is based on Eretz Israel or Greater Israel, and it's a policy of obtaining land either through force or political negotiation and settling the land with Jews. So until that philosophy is modified, altered in some way, there can't be a just peace.
Would you see, just to interrupt you slightly, that modification of that philosophy would include a two-state solution?
Yes, but I'm just saying that it's a kind of pervasive concept, and you see it is that it's a concept of domination, of the Palestinians have to submit to land, and they have to accept peace on Israel's terms. Why should the Palestinians accept what Israel gives them? It should be a negotiation between the two. Israel should
Yeah, Paul.
what the
I think I understood.
Well,
Thank you.
I think I can help you straight away and say, you're right, if that was the philosophy of Zionism, I'd agree with you. It's lucky that's not the philosophy. That's the narrative that's been put out there about Zionism. But Zionism is very simple. It's an establishment of a Jewish state for Jewish people. And anywhere you look about what Zionism is or where it is, that's what you'll see. You won't see a greater Israel anywhere to do with Zionism, because that's a biblical source that has nothing to do with it. Zionism, and just for the history records, in 1948 was accepted, the Zionist was accepted, which was roughly 50% of the state of Israel at the time, and that was what was accepted, and that was we'd be happy to go forward with.
Can I switch the question around a little bit, because again, it's very zero-sum. Do you think that there is a context for what the definition of Zionism is going on at the moment, where there's perhaps a more liberal strain, which is looking for territorial compromise, and perhaps a more sort of aggressive, pernicious strain represented by those settlers living in the centre of Hebron, and so that people here in the UK can choose to focus upon a definition of Zionism that is conveyed through the news, which sits probably more closely with that definition than it would with when you would give.
I think that's right. I think that the problem that the word Zionism, it fits nicely into a soundbite that Zionism equals Nazism, Zionism equals bad, Zionism equals, but that's not. I'm a Zionist, and I want to see a Palestinian state. I want to see equal rights for the Palestinians within their states. I want to see equal rights for all the Arabs across Israel, and I think it's great that the Arabs could go and elect members of parliament within the case that they have 10% representation. There are elements of society that needs to be improved. I could say that about England. I could say that about France. I want to see that. I am an avid Zionist, and I want to sit on the levels of liberal and democracy the same as Europe, on that same level, and that's where the comparison lies. Because if you compare Israel to the rest of the Arab nations, then it's not a comparison. I mean, it's a liberal, democratic, open, accountable society with an open media. Nobody's more critical of Israel than Israel. If you go and look at Israeli newspapers, you will see every single criticism that you come up with within the Israeli newspapers. So that's what I want to see as a Zionist. That's what I want to see.
Okay, I'm going to take 2 questions, maybe 3 questions in a row, and then we can see who wants to answer them on the panel. So, Joe.
Very, very quick one.
We should highlight that this is my co-director, Joe.
Sorry, I won't take much of your time. Just like to ask you, because you did refer to the West Bank earlier as the place where Palestinians live rather than the West Bank, and you've also talked about where the borders, well, you haven't talked about where the borders of the Palestinian state that you'd like to see exist. Can I just ask you where you think that should be? Because you mentioned that actually original Zionism was the kind of 50-50 level. Where would you like the borders to be?
I'm going to take another question as well. So yes, just gentlemen here.
I mean, I just wanted to get away from the zero-sum game and ask you why you did the film, and what was the let's go back to Shimon Paris.
Yeah. So let's take the tough territorial question first, and then thank you.
Well, I'm happy to go along with Abbas's previous statement on where the border should be. Divided into 3 sections. The area which we know and everybody agrees the Palestinians will live. The areas which we agree that will be transferred. The areas which will agree, which will be transferred to the Israeli side. And then the disputed areas in between to form part of the final outcome, final agreement.
So we're clear that's 1967 borders.
So it would be a 1967 borders with some land swaps, which make it feasible for both societies to live in peace and not create future conflict.
And a shared Jerusalem?
And Jerusalem would be part of that negotiation. Where exactly that will be shared, I don't know. That's for the leaders to come up with. But some parts of Jerusalem to be part of the Palestinian state under its control, then I'm happy to see them. But I don't want to see future conflict. What I want to see is an agreement today which settles, which leaves either side only very slightly frustrated, rather than just agreeing a future conflict and a future intifada.
And on that point, because I know that you're somebody who's been a proponent of a one-state solution previously, our cards on the table of OneVoice were very actively promoting a 2-state solution. This is a question I often want to ask you. If a 2-state solution that was satisfying international law and the state position of the PLO and the BAS, if that was on the table, and it was made in good faith? Is it something that you as a Palestinian would support?
Well, it's so hypothetical because you know very well that it is not on the table in real terms. There's a lot of talk about it, but in reality it is not on offer. Let's be very clear about that. However, even if it were on offer, we have to understand that the Palestinians, or the Palestinian leadership of the time, settled for the division, and very unequal division of the country, into 22% for the Palestinians and the rest for Israel. Settled for that only because they didn't believe they would be able to get any more. We must be quite clear. They saw how powerful Israel was. They understood that they would, if they didn't come to some sort of deal, there would be nothing whatever left of Palestine. It's from that basis that they said, all right, we'll take this fifth of our homeland in return for being left alone just to develop it and no more aggression and economies and so on from Israel. That's the reality about the two-state solution. There isn't anything really inherently good about the two-state solution as it is now. You could argue, as I think you said, well, you want to share this land? Fine, why don't you cut it 50%? Why 22% and 78%? Okay, so that's on simply the question of equality and equity. It's not fair that...
But then on morality and equity and fairness as well, I mean, there's millions of Palestinians living in occupation, there's millions of Israelis living in insecurity. If we had the ability to be able to have a deal that would satisfy the majorities within both states, is it something that you think, that, and if you saw it, you said, well, that's fair, it's true sovereignty for Palestinians, it's true freedom and equality, that you'd be able to support despite those reservations?
Well, the thing is, there's so many ifs. Honestly, I find it very difficult to tell you. What it would leave, even if I went along with your reasoning, it would leave one huge problem unsolved. And everybody here knows what that is. It's the elephant in the room. It's the refugees. We have about 6 million Palestinians who have no homeland, and that is the reality. Now, those people need a solution. So if you bear them in mind, and nothing gives anybody the right to say, no, we don't want to talk about them, we're going to talk about this or that. Nobody has the right to do that. These people need a solution, and they need a just solution. Now, the moment you ask the question like that, the answer becomes very clear. It cannot be this division of this small territory. It has to be a proper sharing of the same territory. That's what I believe in, and my view is not emotional. It's based on what is just and what would work. In the end, that's what would work.
I have long arguments about the practicality and the justice of it, personally, but it's an interesting view nonetheless. Changing gears completely, the motivation for why you decided to make this series of films.
Well, your question in particular was on Paris, wasn't it?
Why did you make this film? What was the motivation?
I think the first 3 films, you've got Arafat, then Perez, and then this guy, the president of Costa Rica, Arias. And what you see across all 3 of them is, well, 2 sides of the same conflict, which is an unresolvable conflict, apparently. And then with Arias, you see this guy who was, it's difficult to compare the conflicts, but he was in a very, very complex situation, surrounded by Nicaragua, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Panama to the south. And if you want, Netanyahu talks about a tough neighborhood. He was in a pretty tough neighborhood. Arias was in a pretty tough neighborhood. And he didn't have an army. And he said, we're going to bring these guys around the table and deliver peace. And everyone said, you've got to be insane. You know who you're talking about. Have you met your neighbors? But he did it and delivered peace. And defied the superpowers in the process, because neither Russia or America wanted that to happen. They wanted military victories in each of those countries. And I think the lesson you learn across the 3 films, or certainly I learned across the 3 films, is that it's actually about political will. I think you see it in both the Arafat film and the Peres film. There was that brief moment of light when you had Rabin and you had Arafat, who both wanted to procure peace, and they nearly pulled it off. But ultimately, I think the motivation, or at least the lessons that we try to communicate across the three films, is that it's all down to individual willpower, and not only, and that leadership extends not only from the very top, but it happens on the ground. I mean, if you had to pinpoint one person who was responsible for scuppering the Oslo peace deal, it was Yigal Amir, the guy who assassinated Rabin. And that's just one guy, one lowly individual who wasn't a leader in any way, but he took effectively a leadership decision. In the same way that Arias, as you see in the third film, locked these 5 guys in a room and said, we're not leaving this room until we sign a peace deal, and you're not speaking to any ministers, and you're not going to have your advisors. You're going to come out of this room with peace. That's a kind of long-winded way of saying the reasons we made these things were to kind of show the importance on shaping of our future, of individuals' willpower.
I'll take another couple of questions, I think, at once. Yeah, this gentleman here.
Can I just make a brief comment on that comment? Because I actually took, to the extent, the complete opposite point from your film. Because obviously leadership is very important. But
what is very important?
Individual leadership is very important to shaping the world. But what I took from it was actually that it has limits. And the problem you see there is that you're very dependent on individuals, a constellation of individuals lining up in a certain way to get a deal. And actually what you need is something that can go beyond individual, which involves institutions, a bedrock that supports peace, that isn't wholly dependent on a few brave individuals. Because what you might happen otherwise, you get some brave steps, but it doesn't actually follow through to peace in the long term.
I think there was a second question, somebody over here at the hand up? Yes.
Yes, I always have a difficulty really with these conversations because, as you say, they always descend to a zero-sum game. I can't remember who it was at the end of the film said, what we need is leaders who will come up with something very different and have the power to implement it. I'm actually really intrigued whether we actually don't need any leaders anymore. Maybe they are the problem. Now, I would love to imagine a situation in which we were not bound to wait for leaders to make all these decisions that affected all the rest of us.
Yeah.
And I mean, and to me, this is what as just a member of the public, I find it intensely frustrating all the time to be represented by people who I don't necessarily agree with. And also as a Palestinian to be represented by people I don't necessarily agree with. Certainly people who blow up buses, I don't want to be represented by them. I understand, and I can, in the same way I understand why people do.
There's a
So
great
what is the alternative if we don't have leaders? I mean, why do we think we need them?
There's a great essay by a guy called how do you pronounce that? Khan Ross, on that. In fact, it's a bit complex to go into, but I strongly recommend reading it. Google this guy, Khan Ross. He's a diplomat who resigned. Yeah, he resigned over the Iraq War, and it's exactly on that point. And he makes a really good case for it.
How do you spell the first name?
C-A-R-N-E.
On the question of leadership,
just generally on where we are going with that.
With the Middle East or with leadership?
Well, generally with leadership, if you took the leadership out of Israel, and we all sat down, and I hope we can all agree, potentially, what I envisage in 25 years, hope, 25, 50 years time. I envisaged, up to that time, however long it takes, 2 years or 50 years, I envisaged Israel living alongside what is potentially a united Palestinian Emirates within the West Bank, made up of about 6 different families who run 6 different cities of Ramallah, Shechem, Nablus, Tulkarem, Kalkilia, Hebron, Jericho.
You forgot Jenin. I'm from Jenin.
Jenin, that's right. I'm sorry, Jenin, that's right. There's families, I apologize. Very important, and each family has its own control over the area. I call it an emirate, working together on a single state.
Oh, this is depriving
John,
Palestinians of
please.
I'm saying that it would be their nation, would say...
That's an interesting idea, but I just want to come back to the common thread in both of those questions. Because if you look at Yasser Arafat and Shimon Peres, the subject of the 2 films, whether you like or loathe them, they will probably be seen as titans of 20th century history, for good or bad reasons. And you look around at the current crop of leadership in Israel and Palestine, and President Abbas, whether you like him or not, he's probably not a man with the same sort of enigma and character that Arafat was. And then you've got Bibi Netanyahu, who we could sit here and debate all day long, but is seen by many to be a coward, or at best, and something a lot worse if you're less charitable. But I just want to spin it around slightly, because you've also had in the last 2 years, and this is to both of your points, the single biggest Occupy movement in the world in Israel, where you had like 300,000 people out in the streets without leaders initially, completely calling for social justice. And simultaneously, if not yet in Palestine, although maybe there's shoots going in this direction, but across the Arab world, leaderless protests, throwing out despots in the past. So I think the dynamic you're talking about is certainly taking place. And to your question, that the context, the greater group of people, seems to be taking to the fore, and our previous reliance upon these big totalitarian leaders who, through both of your films, I think have failed us, has become more clear.
Those leaderless protests, though, have produced leaderless societies too. If you look at Egypt, you know, what happened was wonderful, but then what happened, you know, the people can donate you so much, and then you've got this leader or non-leader.
Early days of action as well.
Sorry. Let me just take this, because this is an important point. You're quite right. You see, the question of leadership is crucial. It's very important. You can't actually do without a proper leadership for movements. You can't get very far. And indeed, what's happened in Egypt, what's happening in some other areas in the Arab world, is that you can get thus far on kind of spontaneous protest, etc., but you can't go any further. What I think we need is not no leaders, but it are leaders who actually represent the people that they're leading. So in other words, when you know that people want various things, they have the people who speak for them should do it to represent what they actually want, not another agenda. And the problem on the Palestinian side, sadly, is that is indeed not the case. The current leadership does not represent the wishes of most Palestinians. That's why it's very difficult to see where we go from here.
Jaffer, you had your hand up quite a lot.
Yes, some people who know me, I was sitting there a couple of years ago when we discussed the two-state solutions, and I said to you, if Netanyahu continues doing what he does, it's dead and buried. And it is dead and buried. What I find amazing, I'm a Palestinian, I'm 70 years old, I have thousands of friends who are Jews. We lived together until this gentleman comes from South Africa and that young man comes from somewhere else and say to me, God gave it to me. I mean, when did God become an estate agent? And what about me? I mean, you mentioned the families. My family go back in Palestine in 897. Yet I live in exile. And you go from South Africa, I don't know how old you are, I'm 70, and I'm not allowed to go there. I went there 3 times against my better judgment with my British passport. The way I was treated at the airport twice and at King Hussein Bridge, the way they send these young people who know nothing other than the gun and what they're told, how to treat me, like in the film, go and kill everybody. And they look at me and they said, the questioning, the humiliation, It's all built in to put your back up, so you will make a mistake. And they say, you see, he doesn't want, and so on. When is it that you chaps are going to say, sorry, we did something amazingly wrong. We did not put you in, we did not put you in chambers. We did not kill you. We made you welcome. During the pogroms in Spain, and Ferdinand and Isabella, we opened our doors and our houses, and we cousins, come and sit with us. When is it you are going to admit that you made a mistake and let us all, as Ghada said, live together like we did for centuries?
So Rich, you wanted to come at that first.
Yeah, there's something that sort of worries me about the current situation that came out. We had to look at a truckload of archive making these films. And you see in the language of Rabin, you can sense that here is a guy who fought in 48, knows what went down, knew exactly what went down, and had time and spent a bit of time with Palestinians as neighbours. And particularly in, I think it was the Hebron massacre, you can see his outrage at the peace process and the fact that his language is all about, we've got to get rid of this poisonous past, we've got to move on and form peace. At a similar point in time, and sort of subsequently in the next 20 years to the current day, you've got people like Netanyahu, who never grew up with Palestinians as neighbours, who never grew up with them, and didn't have the experience, didn't have the blood on his hands. He grew up with them as so-called terrorists. So his perspective is completely different. And the angles that they're coming from, and I suspect when you put an 18-year-old kid in a guard tower now, on a border crossing, you say, no, you can't read a book, you can't have an iPod. You've got to look down at those guys and make sure that none of those guys blow you up. And that's going to put a particular perspective into those kids' heads. So the trajectory from Rabin in 48 through to Rabin in 95 and then Netanyahu in 95 to an 18-year-old today is one that's not going in the right direction. And I think that's the problem. And especially if you've got a society where conscription, you've got compulsory conscription. Every single Israeli is at some point sitting on a border with a gun thinking, what I've got to do for the next 8 hours, 5, 6, 7 days a week, is make sure that none of those fuckers blow me up. That's not going to do any good for anybody. And on the other side, the poor guys trying to get through that border, we saw ridiculous lines of cars with fathers being effectively humiliated in front of their kids. Open the car, we want to search the car, and the kids saying, Dad, what's going on? And what's the father's explanation going to be to the kid? So I think as far as, that's the real worry, I think as far as leadership goes and circumstances goes, we're breeding, or the way it's going is completely the wrong direction psychologically.
I think we need
We're going to be thrown out very soon and people do have their hands up. Paul wanted to say something very, very quickly.
Yeah, no problem. I think nobody wants to see humiliation on either side. But I think we can only move forward when two things happen. Number one, the hatred stops on both sides. And number two, the history is correct and factual, because you ask us to apologize for something that was never happened in the first place. So with due respect, your family was not there since the 8th century. The 7th century, Arabs did come into the land, but there was very well documented, and you can read Mark Twain, who covered the land in the 18th century, that there was a few thousand Jews and a few thousand Syrians and a couple of Arab nomads that lived in the north and in the south of that land throughout. The Jews have been there since Jerusalem. Israel is not 50, 60 years old, it is 2,000 years old. So the narrative of history, that's fine, but I cannot apologize for something that never happened. We never hijacked.
One second, sorry if I can. Because Paul, for years and years, I grew up under a certain impression that the Palestinians were told, look, you know, just get the hell out for a few days, we're going to drive the Jews into the sea, and it'll all be okay, you can come back. Okay. Unfortunately, that was a complete lie, as I discovered. And I don't know how you can dispute the historical facts. In 48, there were people living in homes, but kicked out and weren't allowed back.
Again, I'm going back to in the terms.
Why? No, so we're going to move on because we can all dig down century after century after century.
It was the Arab nation. We're going to move on. The Palestinians out because they were going to attack.
This is not.
I'm going to start banging my fist off the table. Okay.
It's not going to be resolved by people saying I am more right than the other.
Exactly.
I think this gentleman is correct. We need to move on.
Absolutely. I did have some other hands up from people who haven't asked questions yet. Yes, sir, you?
Yes, given if we want peace, what are the next steps, please?
Excellent.
Because we do want peace. As far as I'm concerned, I want peace and prosperity for Palestinians and Israelis and everybody. And so what do we do in practice to move on, please?
Excellent. I'm going to take one more question as well, and we're going to then try and end. I think we're going to end answering your question, in fact, sir. But yes, this gentleman.
Yeah, it's actually just a question on film, and I thought actually it was a really interesting film, and obviously had great access to Perez and his family, and some people worked with. But I just want to know if you could have got access to anybody else as a contributor, who would you got?
Let's know.
Okay, there you go. And this gentleman is very patient.
Oh, sorry, hold on.
Dalia Rabin.
Yeah.
Dalia Rabin.
Yeah.
She didn't make much of an impact, unfortunately, in society.
I tell you what I heard her say on the phone.
We'll have a dialogue afterwards. This gentleman here, yes, sir.
Maybe I don't understand history, maybe things didn't happen. But what I do know is at the time after the First World War, the League of Nations gave the possibility to the Jews to have their own country. There was a mandate, a British mandate, and in 1947 there was a partition. Now, as far as I understand, with all this story, both sides suffered a lot. But what happened there? A lot of refugees went to Gaza, went to Jordan, went to Syria, went to Lebanon, went to Iraq. But the Jews of all those places went to Israel. So they were refugees as well. They lived in tents, they suffered immensely, yet they built their homeland because they felt it was there. While the Arab states, which really, actually it was the Arab League, I think it was called, created a war which was against Israel, and they lost. Now, because they lost, there was an outcome.
I understand your question.
The whole problem, what about these Jews who live in Israel?
Yes.
Is it not the same as Turkey and Greece?
No, it's not. And I'm going to take the opportunity as a lost Irish Catholic to give you my perspective, having spent a lot of time there.
Could you speak a bit louder?
Sure, I'm sorry.
It's not that.
The parallels I see between the common Jewish experience in Europe and the Palestinian experience in the Arab world are incredible. Because Palestinians are not welcomed into the societies that they live in, because their land is Palestine. The same way that Jews were stateless in Europe, and they were never welcomed into societies in Europe, and they had a tragic existence for thousands of years.
He's comparing us with the Jews coming from Arab land.
Yes, but the Jews, no, let me finish, Paul. No, but the Jews aren't welcome in Arab land.
850,000 Jewish refugees from Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Iran. That's what he's comparing
lately,
which will never get the houses back.
When the Egyptians, there were problems with the Egyptians and Gaza, and the Egyptians closed the border.
I understand.
The Palestinians in Gaza, they said, we are Egyptians because we came from Egypt to Palestine to work. Now they don't let us go back. This was unbelievable.
So for the same reason, again, I want things to end on a slightly different note. For the same reason that there are still so many outstanding claims from every participant in this conflict because it's unresolved. And I think, personally speaking, this should absolutely be something that's on the table when the final status deal is discussed. Taking that point, And I think asking every single panelist to answer the best question of the evening, in my view, what do you think needs to happen practically to get us out of what we agree is a very polarised, very depressing, very sad situation now, to a position where we're at least making progress towards the kind of reality where Israelis and Palestinians live in peace? And Richard, can you start off?
Oh, it's political will. It's all down to political will. It's all down to leadership. Nothing else counts. I would hope that would be irrefutable if once you've seen all three films. You just think, like, so many things.
And in the absence of leaders, you wait.
No, I think. Well, the other thing that I certainly learned making the films was that we're a bit stupid, we're a bit thick, and we generally learn through pain. And if that means a third intifada, whatever that means, at some point, everyone says, you know, we've really got to stop this. And the question is, as I think Rabbi Ashman says in the film, how much pain is it going to take? You could write the answer to the existing problem, what needs to be created. You could write it on one piece of paper. You know, it's so simple. Everyone knows where we've got to get to. How much pain is it going to take before someone says, okay, well, let's do it?
Ghada, would you like to answer that question? What's with practicality and future oriented?
Sure. Just one thing to the gentleman there. I think, Leo, you would benefit.
Could you speak a bit louder?
No, I can't. I've got a cold. Why don't you come here?
Come closer.
That's like the peace treaties that we have. It's actually the same thing.
But look, I think you would benefit from reading a very good book by an Iraqi Jewish woman called Rachel Shabi. She's quite well known, S-H-A-B-I. She wrote a book called Not the Enemy, and that's all about Jews in Arab lands. So I think you'll get a much better...
And I would say something else.
No,
we'll have time afterwards for it. We'll have time afterwards.
Read it. It's very, I just read it now.
Let's afterwards we can have a discussion. So with that caveat.
That's just a piece of advice to you, because I think you would benefit. Now, in terms of the next step, look, I have to tell you, I'm not optimistic. I'm quite gloomy, because we cannot talk about what we would like to see. The reality is that the Israelis, I'm afraid, the Israelis are really not interested in a peace settlement with the Palestinians. It's obvious to me that they're not. Look at the Israeli...
Are you talking about the population or the
leadership? No, I'm talking about the Israeli leadership. The Israeli leadership is really not interested. And a majority of the population is not interested either. The reasons are very clear. You see, Israel has things very nicely, thank you. They have a pacified Palestinian population, which they patrol and they police with the checkpoints and the walls and so on, which really are not much trouble, let's face it. In Gaza, there's trouble from time to time, but they can swoop down and bash them as they've just done.
So, but rather than analysis of where we are,
no, I'm explaining to you why. It's no good my telling you what I'd like. You know what I'd like to see. I'm telling you, with the situation as it is, there can be no peace agreement because Israel, which is the party, the powerful party, which would be required to make a move, is not going to make the move because things are going very nicely in Israel's favor. The only thing that would change that would be a change in the United States. Israel cannot survive without American support. If there were a change in the American position, then we might get some movement. But sitting here, pretending to ourselves that it's just a question of bringing the two sides together, is futile. We know that the two sides have been trying to get together for 20 years. Look at the result. There's no result. So long as it's left to the two sides, which are unequal in any agreement, in any agreement, you cannot have an extremely powerful party and a weak party and leave them to each other. You have to have a third force. And that third force is the United States, and it's not doing its job. So I'm sorry that I can't tell you much more, anything more cheerful.
Well, at least there's an opportunity there for change. We change US foreign policy, we can change the situation. And Paul, on that same note then, practical steps.
I think both sides inside, it's not because for any political reasons, but I think from the Palestinian side, I think we need to change the education that's being fed at the moment to the new generation. And that's, for example, if you look at the Palestinian flag, it's the whole of Israel. This is what Israelis are seeing. We're seeing the aspirations.
Israeli school books.
No, it's not. No. Israelis are learning what the Palestinians' flag is about and what the Palestinian children teach the children, that the whole of Palestine will be redeemed. We will have our freedom in the entire Palestine. So I think from us, we need for this generation and the next generation of Palestinians to know that Israel will be there in 100 years. And Israel will be, whatever part, however we come to the agreement, Israel will be there in 200 years. And once I think that acceptance, once they accept that Israel is here to stay, I think you need the right timing, because there are Israeli leaders that are prepared to sit down and negotiate. We've seen that with the two leaders. We had Ehud Olmert and we had Barak. So there are Israeli leaders which are prepared to make the tough decisions with going towards peace. So I think the timing needs to be right with the right Israeli leader.
Yeah.
And I think the acceptance from the Palestinians that Israel will be there in 100 years.
And while we wait, this is an important clarification, while we wait for that generation of Palestinian school children to grow up with different school books, does Israel continue to build settlements in the territory that will make a Palestinian state?
Well, very simply, Israel made peace with Egypt and moved all the settlements out of the Sinai. So the settlements are just brick and mortar and can be moved just as easily as they were out of the Sinai, and made a peace with Egypt, which has lasted. It's a tough peace, but it has lasted. And they've moved, very tough, you saw it, out of Gaza. They moved homes out of Gaza. So settlements are, wherever they are, and there'll be other dispute, those that are not within the Israeli borders will be dismantled, because it's very clear the Palestinians said, we don't want a Jew living in our land. They've made it very clear, so they will have to be moved. And the Arabs that are living in Israel will continue to live in Israel, and we will work towards a 100% equalized society where there is trust on the minorities together.
I wonder, just very briefly, as a school kid, if your teacher said to you, these Israeli chaps, they're lovely fellows, the government's a bit misguided, but they're lovely, and we should love them, and they're going to be here forever, so we should love them, really. How that kid would feel every day when he's got to queue up and go through a border and watch his dad get pulled out of the car. Do you think that
I think
they'd absorb the lesson from the teacher, or they'd think the teacher was an idiot?
I think that is a very, very leading question, because I could put on the other side to say, teaching the children and their songs. I can assure you, go to palwatch.org, where they're teaching the children to dress up in suicide belts and say, all we need to do is kill as many Jews as possible, because
that's an extreme.
But that's not extreme.
But there's two extremes, aren't there? So both sides.
British-funded schools in Palestine, palwatch.org, you will see this in Arabic, where children are taught to kill Jews. So I think I could say yours is a leading question, and I didn't come with mine. You came with your leading question. I didn't even mention my leading question about that. Okay. What I want to see is you need to grow up to learn to live with Israel, who are going to be there in 100 years, and it will get better. That's what I want to see.
Through the book Mein Kampf, in Egypt and in many
It's a separate argument, it's very valid, but it's for a different day. We're going to be...
So I'm just going to give him our friend
incredibly short.
Just a very short recommendation. First of all, it's not fair to you. We're treating you as if you were the state of Israel.
Yeah.
But you're not. You're, I'm sure, a very well-meaning person. There's a book you could really benefit from reading, and it's by an Israeli called E.L. Weizmann, and the book is called Hollow Land. Hollow Land. That's all about the settlements. That will show you that it is impossible to remove the settlements from the West Bank. You must read the book. It's very important.
Okay, now no one asked me, but I'll tell you why I think there's a couple of reasons to be slightly more optimistic than the synthesis as the panel will tell you. I mean, there is an as yet untested and unformed government in Israel, and I can speak as somebody with OneVoice. In OneVoice, that we managed to mobilise 500,000 Israelis to get up off their couches and vote, and hopefully try and tip things back towards a more moderate direction than it seems to be going. We have thousands of Palestinians taken to hillsides in Area C to protest against land that's going to be seized, settlements and a two-state solution to get further away. We have a president with a brand new mandate who, I mean, I think Ghada is probably quite pessimistic about his intent to act, but at least he has a fresh mandate and the ability to do so. And there's at least dozens of British people that are willing to sit in a room and get engaged in this debate and maybe play a role to try and help.
Can I add another point to what you're saying? There's a new movement arising out of the occupation called URI, which means arise, which is trying to get grassroots Israelis politically involved in a social democratic-based discussion of the society, which is very peace-oriented as well. URI.
URI, it's definitely worth Googling, I agree.